The transatlantic relationship is shifting with U.S. President Donald Trump's return to the White House. So, are we seeing a new world order emerging? I'm Veronica Dudo. Let's find out.
This is In America Today from the Ticker News Studios in New York City.
The Trump administration is pushing a new strategy for Europe, one that prioritizes a rapid resolution to the Ukraine war while encouraging Europe to take the lead on its own defense. This comes as European leaders, including the European Commission president, to reaffirm their alliance with the U.S., but acknowledge the need for Europe to step up its role in defense. At the same time, the European Commission is urging citizens to stockpile essential supplies for at least 72 hours in case of emergencies, signaling a shift in preparedness amid global uncertainties. For more, I am joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis. He's the author of 12 books and a senior fellow at the Family Research Council. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Veronica.
First, let's begin with the transatlantic relations. It seems to be potentially at a turning point. How might these developments reshape global security dynamics?
Well, clearly, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is taking a much larger role than just what's happening in Europe. We have NATO allies that are helping us in the Pacific as well as in Africa, the Middle East, and so forth. So as the U.S. shifts its attention to China, which is the primary adversary that we're concerned about, you will find, strategically, our papers will begin to look in that direction. In fact, our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is over there right now. So the NATO alliance has to begin to wean itself away from its overwhelming dependence upon the United States and our might, and to begin to watch out for its own well-being. And that's why President Trump has called for increases in defense spending in all those countries, well beyond the 2%. And of course, we have the countries in the Nordic region, the Baltics, certainly the East, like the Poles, are ramping up their investments in kinetic capabilities, tanks and planes and the like. And primarily, I suspect it's because of the threat they believe is posed by Vladimir Putin and the Russians, given the ongoing war with Ukraine, which could, at this point, go just about anywhere.
And you, of course, have been studying this for a long time. What do you make of any potential significance from the European Commission urging citizens to stockpile supplies for emergencies?
Now, I think it's a prudent thing. Keep in mind, during the Cold War, we had a different deterrence level, a different preparation level. I think it's noteworthy that, for instance, the Swedes used to publish a book to its citizens throughout the Cold War, and they discontinued it in the early 90s. And then here in the last year, they restarted this. This little booklet says this is what happens in times of distress, in times of war, and the preparations that you ought to make. Now, given the ramping up of their own internal security as well as NATO security, it makes prudent sense, given what's going on to their east, that the citizens of all those countries, the European Union, begin to think about what they haven't wanted to think about since the Cold War, and that is either disruption to their infrastructure or, in fact, an invasion. I would argue, having been to both Russia and Ukraine, that the Ukrainians weren't thinking about what would happen if, in fact, the Russians invaded as they did in February of 2022, and then what preparations they needed to make. They were, arguably unprepared with the types of resources that they needed, but quickly came to the realization that they had to do much more than they have done. And I suspect that that's true with much of Western Europe.
Now, we have heard from the Trump administration, they're advocating for a new U.S. approach to Europe. What are the key elements of this strategy?
Well, the question is going to be who's going to command the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I know the idea of floating another nation's leader rather than historically it's always been a U.S. four-star general. That would be significant. And of course, who's going to pay more of the load that's required to run the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because it's a massive organization with 31 countries spanning from Turkey and Greece and Italy and Spain in the south all the way to the Nordic countries now, especially Sweden and Finland. So you have a broad swath of the world that's involved in an alliance that has up to now involved the United States. Well, if we were to wean ourselves away from that, right now we have forces in Italy, certainly in Spain, a lot in Germany and elsewhere, even in Poland with the Fifth Corps over there. We have a fairly sizable footprint even this day. And now, if we were to retract that, they would have to be replaced with capabilities that, in many cases, the Europeans don't have. Refueling capabilities, certainly flat tops, aircraft carriers, a lot of artillery, a lot of bombers and the like. Those capabilities, someone would have to spin up. And right now, a lot of Europeans just don't have that capability. So either NATO or the European Union has to figure out long term what's in their best interest, given the threats. And the threats, of course, are far beyond, arguably, the Russians. I would argue the Chinese are making inroads in Western Europe through their investments. And then also, they have great ambitions in the Arctic, which is, of course, not a part of China because it's not an Arctic country, but it has aspirations not only for extraction of energy and rare earth metals, but also it has security interests. And that's, of course, in alignment with the Russians that are already an Arctic country. So you have a host of issues here that are brewing. And of course, the turbulence across the world, not just in Eastern Europe, but also the Middle East, and arguably even in the Americas, where we have our own ongoing turbulence. These are factors that the Europeans look around and say, look, given the modern technology of hypersonic weapons and cyber attacks and artificial intelligence and drones, the warfare and the disruption of economies is something that we've got to deal with. And so as a European Union, much like the United States deals with domestic threats, they have to deal with a host of things that are coming their way.
Now, as you mentioned, of course, President Trump, he is in his first 100 days. We saw a lot of action with Europe, but of course, Pete Hegseth is in Asia. We know the Department of Defense and other U.S. agencies have long talked about, the threat China imposes. But we're starting to see a lot of chatter where people are saying if the United States steps back a little bit from Europe, that this could be a way for China to start charming Europeans and making their way there. Kind of, how do you see all of this with, the U.S. trying to balance their commitment with Europe, but then also understanding the true threat that China, continues to pose?
Well, China's threat is very serious. It's not only economic, and Belt and Road Initiative has demonstrated that in 150 nations around the world. It's strategic, it's security-wise, their military buildup. If you look at the Pentagon's annual report to Congress, the most recent was in December of 2024, they make it very clear that the threat from China is real, it's growing, it is now significant in terms of nuclear. They have the largest standing army in the world. They have the largest navy in the world. And they're growing elsewhere as well. And so if you read the statements that are published by President Xi, the president and also the leader, chairman of the Communist Chinese Party, then you come to the realization that he is serious about his hegemonic ambitions across the world. And I wrote a book a few years ago, Kings of the East, which is all about China and where they've come from, they want to go. And where they want to go is to once again reemerge as the Middle Kingdom. In other words, the great hegemon of the world. And that's why we find throughout South America, throughout Africa, major shift in Chinese sympathies and support. You find them reaching out across the first, second, and third island chain across the Pacific. You see them all over the Middle East with strategic arrangements, especially with the likes of the Ayatollah in Iran, and then even in Central America. You have, of course, a big, I suppose, feather ruffling with President Trump over the Panama Canal, in which there were Chinese firms that were operating both ends of the Panama Canal, which we built 100 years ago, but are now, quite frankly, dominated by Chinese. And so when you look around the world, you come to the realization that our primary adversary is the Chinese, and the Chinese are incredibly ambitious. They want the Arctic, they want the Antarctic, they want a piece of every part of this world, and of course they want a new world order, and that new world order would put them in the driver's seat of economically, strategically, ideologically, which of course to those in the West that are democratic, we are very concerned about what this may mean.
Retired Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, thank you so much for all of your insight and, very thoughtful answers on all of this, that's unfolding in our world today.
Thank you, Veronica. Have a good day.
This is Ticker. We'll be right back.